Vincent Serrano slammed his fist on the table, hard enough to make the water glasses shake. "She is the daughter of a thief," he said, loud enough for every person in that room to hear. "And you brought her into this family." 30 pairs of eyes turned toward Dominic, and then every single one of them turned toward Claire. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She stood in that room full of dangerous men and looked Vincent Serrano directly in the face, like she was deciding whether he was worth her time. Vincent leaned forward. "Tell me, Dominic, what exactly is this woman to you?" The room went completely silent, and Dominic Serrano, the man who had never hesitated in his life, said nothing. If you've ever trusted someone and watched them go quiet, at the exact moment you needed them to speak, you already know what happened next, inside Claire's chest. 6. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Claire discovered about her own father will change everything you think you know about this moment. Hit the like button. Drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The night that changed everything started with a stranger. Not Dominic, not Vincent, not the Serrano family with their silk suits and their quiet violence, and their penthouse high above soul. Started with an old woman sitting alone on a subway platform bench, one hand pressed flat against her chest, the other gripping her purse. She was trying to purse strap like she was to hold herself together through sheer willpower. Claire Whitmore almost walked past her. That is the honest truth, and it matters. She almost kept walking because she was late, because it was cold, because her shoes were soaked through from rain, and she still had 40 minutes of studying ahead of her, and a scholarship review meeting the following morning that made her stomach hurt every time she thought about it. She was 27 years old, and tired in the particular way that comes not from laziness, but from fighting for everything you have every single day without a break. She almost walked past, but there was something about the way the woman's breathing looked wrong. Not panicked, just wrong. Like a machine running on fumes that doesn't know yet it's about to stop. Claire stopped. She crouched down next to the woman and said, in the careful Korean she had been working on for 11 months, "Excuse me, are you all right?" The woman looked up at her. Her eyes were sharp, even then. Whatever was happening to her body, her mind was completely present. "I am fine," the woman said. "You're not fine," Claire said quietly, not unkindly, just honestly. She called emergency services. Then she sat down on that bench next to a complete stranger and stayed there while the crowds on the platform moved around them, like water around two rocks. People glanced over, a few slowed down. Nobody stopped. Claire held the woman's hand and talked to her about nothing in particular. About the rain. About how Seoul looked different in winter than she'd expected. About the restaurant near her university that put too much gochujang in everything, and she had learned to love it anyway. The woman's name, Claire, learned while they waited, was Hai Jin. She did not yet know what that name meant in this city. Paramedics arrived. Claire answered their questions clearly, gave them the timeline, described the symptoms exactly as she had observed them, then stepped back so they could work. One of the paramedics looked at her briefly, with something that might have been surprise, not at what she'd done, but at how calm she was while doing it. Claire was not calm, but she had learned years ago that feeling afraid and acting afraid are two completely different choices. She went home. She studied. She didn't sleep well. 3 days later, a car arrived outside her university building. Not a regular car. The kind of car that doesn't need to announce itself, because the way it sits in the street does all the announcing. Dark, quiet, patient. A man in a dark coat stepped out and told Claire, with old-fashioned courtesy, that the family of Hyjin Serrano would like to invite her to dinner. Claire almost said no. She was behind on a paper. She had nothing appropriate to wear to whatever dinner this clearly was. And something about the formality of the invitation, the weight of it, the way the man said, family made the back of her neck feel strange. She said yes anyway. This was either going to be interesting or it was going to be a story she'd tell for the rest of her life. She had no idea it was going to be both. The Serrano estate sat at the end of a private road in a part of Seoul that didn't appear on tourist maps. The house itself was old money trying to look quiet about it. Restrained, immaculate, expensive, in the way that doesn't need to prove anything. There were guards at the gate, not aggressive, just present. Kind of presence that communicates information without words. Claire had worn the nicest thing she owned, which was a dark blazer over a clean white shirt, and she had felt reasonably confident about it until the car turned into that driveway, and she understood where she was going. Then she felt slightly underdressed. She went in anyway. Hai-jin was seated in a formal sitting room and looked entirely recovered, upright, composed, dressed in something understated that somehow managed to be the most dignified piece of clothing in the room. When she saw Claire, something softened in her face. Not sentimentally, more like recognition. "You stayed," Hai-jin said. "Of course," Claire said. And then, because she genuinely meant it, and because she had never been very good at small talk when plain speech was available, "I would have stayed for anyone." Hai-jin studied her for a moment. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why you were worth meeting again." They had tea. They talked. Hai-jin asked about Claire's graduate program, and listened to the answer with real attention, not the performance of attention that older, powerful people sometimes give younger women, but the actual thing. She asked a specific follow-up question about Claire's thesis on emerging market trade corridors that made Claire momentarily forget she was sitting in the home of someone she'd met 48 hours ago on a subway platform. Then the door opened. Later, Claire would think about the precise moment she first saw Dominic Serrano, and she would be annoyed at herself for how clearly she remembered it because it suggested something about her reaction that she wasn't ready to admit. He was tall. That much was simply fact. And he was dressed the way men dress, when they have stopped thinking about clothing and simply arrived at a permanent solution to it. Dark suit, no tie, exactly as formal as he needed to be, and not 1 degree more. He moved across the room like someone who had long ago stopped being aware of how other people responded to him entering a space. He crossed to his grandmother first, touched her hand briefly, said something quiet in Korean that Claire didn't catch. Then he looked at Claire. His expression was unreadable. Not unfriendly, exactly. Not cold. More like a door with no handle visible on the outside. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His English was perfect, which somehow she hadn't expected. "I'm told you're the one who stayed with my grandmother." "I am," Claire said. There was a pause that felt slightly too long. "Thank you," Dominic said, and that was it. 2 words, delivered with the kind of stiffness that suggested he had practiced, saying them 3 times in the car on the way downstairs, and still wasn't entirely sure he'd gotten the delivery right. Claire tilted her head. "That was terrible," she said. The room temperature seemed to drop by approximately 4 degrees. Dominic blinked once. "I'm sorry?" "The thank you. It was terrible." She wasn't being cruel about it. She was being, as usual, honest. "You looked like you were reading off a card someone else wrote." Hai-jin made a small sound from her chair that was possibly a laugh and possibly a cough, and was definitely neither. Dominic stared at Claire for a long, long moment. Something moved across his face. Something she couldn't name, like a very old window that's been painted shut, shifting slightly in its frame. "I don't get a lot of practice," he said finally. "At thanking people? At any of this." It was the most honest thing he'd said since walking into the room. She could tell because his voice changed. When he said it dropped half a register, lost whatever practiced quality the first few sentences had carried. Claire looked at him steadily. "Well," she said, "you've got time to work on it." Then she turned back to Hai-jin and asked a follow-up question about the history of the neighborhood, and Dominic was left standing approximately 3 feet away from the most unimpressed human being he had encountered in years. He didn't leave the room. He sat down across from them without quite being invited to, and for the next hour he said almost nothing. He just listened, which was, though Claire didn't know this yet, extremely unusual behavior for a man who had spent the last decade making sure everything in every room happened on his terms. When she left that evening, he watched the car pull away from an upstairs window. He was still standing there after the taillights disappeared. The second time they met was at a family dinner 3 weeks later, to which Claire had been invited by Hai-jin with an offhandedness that made it sound optional and wasn't. This time Claire knew what she was walking into. This time she dressed deliberately. Same blazer. She'd decided it was her armor and she was keeping it. There were about 12 people at the table. Some of them, she later learned, were family. Several were something else business associates. Advisors, the kind of men who occupy the periphery of power and make themselves useful by staying close to whoever holds it. They were polite to her in the particular way that people are polite to someone whose presence they haven't yet decided how to categorize. She sat next to an older man named Mr. Chun, who spoke about an international expansion proposal for one of the Serrano Group's legitimate holding companies with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously disagreed with. Claire listened. She ate her soup. Mr. Chun described a proposed entry strategy for a South American market that hinged on a trade corridor, assumption that Claire recognized was approximately 3 years out of date. The regulatory environment he was referencing had changed significantly. She had written 40 pages about exactly this class of error in her second-year seminar. She didn't say anything for about 12 minutes. Then Dominic, from across the table, looked at her. He hadn't been looking at her, obviously. She noticed him not looking at her in the careful way. People don't look at something they're paying attention to. But now he was looking at her directly, and his expression said something she didn't have words for yet, something that was almost a question. "Miss Whitmore," he said, calmly, "you've been quiet." "I've been eating," she said. "You haven't touched your food in about 6 minutes." "Accurate." She put down her spoon. "The corridor he's describing," she said, nodding towards Mr. Chun, was closed to that class of foreign holding company in 2021. There's a bilateral amendment that reroutes it through a different licensing structure. The whole entry timeline needs to be rebuilt from that assumption, or the legal exposure alone could cost you the first 18 months of operations. Silence. Mr. Chun looked at her with the expression of a man who has been told something he doesn't want to believe by someone he didn't expect to speak. Claire didn't look away from him. Dominic set down his fork. "Walk me through it," he said quietly. "From the 2021 amendment." So she did. Right there at the dinner table, with soup going cold and 12 people watching her, she walked through it clearly and without apology. She wasn't performing. She was just saying what she knew, the way she always had. Because information that could prevent a serious mistake wasn't something she was willing to sit on to make other people comfortable. When she finished, Dominic looked at one of his advisors, a man in his 50s, with the air of someone rarely corrected. The advisor gave a very small nod. "She's right," he said. He didn't sound happy about it. Dominic looked back at Claire. He didn't say anything, but something changed in his face. Not dramatically. Nothing Dominic did was dramatic. She was already beginning to understand. But it was unmistakable. The shift from looking at someone you've decided is interesting to looking at someone you've decided is necessary. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She went back to her soup. The warning appeared on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the dinner. Claire arrived at her university building to find a handwritten note slid under the door of her study carrel in the graduate library. No envelope, no signature. 6 words in printed Korean characters that her language app translated without drama. "Stop going to the Serrano house." She stared at the note for a long time. Then she photographed it, put it in her bag, and went to her morning class. She was frightened. That is the truth, and she wouldn't have lied about it if anyone had asked. Her hands weren't entirely steady during the first part of the lecture. Her concentration fragmented twice. She kept doing the involuntary scan of the room that she recognized from exactly 0 previous experiences with threatening notes and somehow still knew how to do. But she didn't tell anyone, not yet. She needed to think first. She needed to figure out whether this was serious or whether it was someone low-level trying to make themselves feel important by frightening a foreign graduate student. She needed to decide, calmly, what it meant and what she should do about it. That evening, she found that someone had accessed her university email account. Nothing was deleted, but she could tell from the metadata that it had been opened from an external device. Her scholarship records had been flagged for a review she hadn't requested, citing an anomaly in her application documentation that she knew for a fact didn't exist. This was not someone low-level. This was someone who knew exactly which pressure points to press to make a scholarship-dependent international student feel like the ground was shifting under her. She sat in her apartment and thought about calling Dominic. She didn't. She didn't have his number, for one thing. For another, the idea of calling him felt like accepting some change in the nature of what this was that she wasn't ready to accept. She called her friend back in Portland instead. Her college roommate, a woman named Diana, who answered the phone with, "It's 11 p.m. here. You'd better be in trouble." "I might be in a situation," Claire said. Define situation. Someone left me a threatening note and hacked my email. A very long pause. Claire. What did you do? I helped an old woman on a subway platform. That is the most you thing you have ever said to me. They talked for an hour. Diana made her laugh twice, which was what Diana was for. By the time they hung up, Claire had decided two things. She was not leaving Seoul, and she was going to find out who was doing this before they found a way to actually damage something irreplaceable. Dominic found out before she told him. This was, she later learned, because he had already assigned someone to monitor for exactly this kind of activity around anyone connected to his household, and Claire had been added to that list after the first dinner without her knowledge, which she had complicated feelings about when she found out. He appeared at her university building on a Thursday afternoon. Not the car time, he came himself, and he was early enough that she came out to find him standing in the hallway, looking like the wrong thing had been put in the right place. He didn't waste time on preamble. Someone's been going through your records, he said. I know, she said. I noticed. He looked at her. You noticed and you didn't? I was working on figuring out who before I started making calls. He stared at her. You got a threatening note, and your records were flagged, and your response was to start an independent investigation. Yes, by yourself. Who else was I going to call? He was quiet for a moment. Me. I didn't have your number, she said. Then, because it was also true, and I wasn't sure that was the right move. They were standing in a hallway with graduate students walking past them, and Dominic Serrano looked at her like she was a problem. He had never encountered the formula for. Whoever is doing this, he said carefully, has access to information about your connection to my family, which means they likely have access to something inside my organization. The word likely did a lot of work in that sentence. She understood that it meant certainly, and that he had chosen the softer word deliberately. How close are you to figuring out who it is? She asked. Not close enough. He said it like it cost him something to admit. Then we have a problem, she said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I want you to leave Seoul. The hallway seemed to get quieter, though it wasn't actually quieter. No, she said. Claire, this is my degree, my scholarship. I have 14 months left, and I'm not leaving because someone is trying to make me afraid. I understand that. But the people who Dominic, she said his name for the first time without thinking about it, and she felt him register it. I have been working toward this for 4 years. I gave up a job offer. I moved to a country where I barely spoke the language. I am surviving on a scholarship that doesn't cover everything, and I cover the rest by tutoring undergraduates 3 nights a week. I am not giving that up because powerful men have decided that fear should make that decision for me. Silence. He looked at her for a very long time. You tutor undergraduates, he said finally. 3 nights a week. Yes. On top of a full graduate course load. I said what I said. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite something else. It was the expression of a man encountering, for approximately the second or third time, a person who occupies a category he doesn't have a name for yet. I have a proposal, he said. His voice had changed. Gone back to the careful register he used when he was about to say something that required precision. I'm listening, she said, and he told her. Later, she would try to reconstruct the exact sequence of her reactions. The first was, that is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. The second was, it would actually solve several problems at once, which is annoying. The third was the part she didn't examine too closely. A 6-month engagement, public enough to provide her with protection, structured enough to get the Serrano Council off Dominic's back about stability and succession, fake in every meaningful sense of the word. You understand, she said, that if I agree to this, I have conditions. I expected that, real conditions, not negotiating room. Tell me. She took a breath. I continue my degree, full course load, every commitment, every class. You don't interfere with my academic schedule for any reason. Agreed. I attend any business meetings you want me at, as an equal participant, not decoration. If I see a problem, I say so. If I disagree, I say so. In the room, in front of whoever is there. He was quiet for a moment. Agreed. You don't decide what I wear, where I go when I'm not with you, or what I believe about anything. Agreed. And when this ends, it ends cleanly. No complications, no leverage, nothing held over either of us. He looked at her steadily. Agreed, he said. She looked back at him. Why? She asked. Why what? Why are you agreeing to all of it? There was a pause. A real one, not the kind he used for effect. Because, he said, you're the first person in a very long time who asked me for nothing. She didn't have an answer for that. She said yes, and neither of them knew yet what they had just agreed to walk into. She moved into the penthouse on a Saturday. Not because Saturday was convenient, because that was the day Dominic's security team determined the risk level around her university apartment had reached a threshold they weren't comfortable with. And they communicated this to Dominic, who communicated it to Claire at 7 in the morning via a text message that said, "Today would be a good day to make the move." Claire stared at her phone for a full minute. Then she texted back, "You could have asked." Reply came in under 30 seconds, I'm asking. She packed 2 bags and a box of books. She left her apartment the way she always kept it clean. Nothing wasted, nothing sentimental on the walls. She had learned early that you don't decorate a place you're not sure you're staying in, and she had been sincere about a lot of places in her life. The scholarship apartment in Seoul was just the most recent one. Car arrived at 9. The driver didn't offer to help with her bags. She didn't ask him to. The penthouse was on the 41st floor of a building in Gangnam that made her university apartment feel like a different country, which, in a way, it was. The elevator required a key card. The hallway was carpeted in something that absorbed sound the way expensive things always do, as though the building itself had been designed to muffle the outside world. Dominic was not there when she arrived. A woman named Mrs. Park, who managed the household staff, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this for 20 years, showed Claire the guest room. It was larger than her entire apartment. It had a window that looked out over the city at a window made Seoul Sinsixel at an angle that made Seoul look like something invented rather than built. Claire set her bags down. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought, "What in the world have you done, Claire?" Then she unpacked her books, arranged them on the desk in the order she needed them, and opened her laptop to work on the bibliography section of a paper that was due in 11 days. She was 3 paragraphs in when Dominic came home. She heard him before she saw him voices in the hallway, low and clipped, the kind of conversation that ends rather than finishes. Then quiet. Then a knock at her door. "Come in," she said without looking up from her screen. He opened the door and stood in the frame. He'd been somewhere that required the full armor, dark suit, the whole presentation. He looked at her sitting at the desk with her laptop and her stack of books and her half-empty coffee cup, and something crossed his face that she couldn't quite read. "You're working," he said. "I'm always working. I thought you might want a tour. I found the kitchen. I found the coffee. I'm fine." He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Park I don't need Mrs. Park to make my coffee." She did look up then, briefly. "I'm not helpless. I'm just housed differently than I was this morning." He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. Watching her in that way, he had not staring. Exactly. More like he was filing information, without deciding yet what category it belonged in. "Are you always like this?" he said. "Like what?" "Like you arrived somewhere you've lived for 10 years. Thought about that for a second. I adjust fast. I always have." She went back to her screen. "Was there something you needed? Or were you checking to make sure I hadn't rearranged the furniture?" A pause. "Dinner is at 7, he said. "If you want." "I'll be hungry by 7. I'll tell Mrs. Park. You can also just tell me and I'll figure it out myself." Pushed off the door frame. She heard him walk away down the hall. She waited until his footsteps had faded, then sat back in her chair and let out a breath she'd been holding without realizing it. This was going to be complicated. She already knew that. She went back to work anyway. Dinner that first night was the most formally awkward meal Claire had eaten since a disastrous Thanksgiving at her college boyfriend's parents' house in Connecticut, and for roughly the same reason, 2 people sitting across from each other who had agreed to something neither had fully thought through, performing normalcy over food, neither was particularly focused on eating. Dominic asked about her paper. She told him more than she intended to, because once she started talking about the argument she was building around post-pandemic trade corridor shifts in Southeast Asia, she had difficulty stopping, and he kept asking follow-up questions that were actually intelligent, which was disarming. She asked about his day. "Son." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. You don't have to tell me things, she said. But then don't ask me things and expect the trade to be one-sided. He looked at her across the table. There was a meeting, he said, with two men who have been underperforming for 6 months and choosing to blame external factors rather than their own decisions. It went about as well as those meetings go, meaning badly. Meaning, I don't have the patience I used to for people who lie to my face about things I already know the answer to. She nodded slowly. So you verified before you walked in? Always. Then why have the meeting at all? Because there's a difference between knowing someone is lying and demonstrating it in a way they can't reconstruct afterward. She thought about that. That's exhausting. Yes, he said. And again, his voice dropped slightly when he said it. Like the word came from somewhere further back than the front of his mouth. It is. They ate for a while in silence. That was less uncomfortable than it probably should have been. My father used to say, Claire said, not planning to say it until she did, that the loneliest thing in the world is being the person in the room who already knows the answer and has to wait for everyone else to catch up. Dominic was quiet. Your father sounds like he was a specific kind of person, he said. He was. She kept her eyes on her plate. He died when I was 19. Heart attack. He was 51. I'm sorry. He was the best person I've ever known, she said. Matter of fact. Not performing grief, just stating a fact the way you state the weather. He worked international trade consulting. He was gone a lot when I was a kid. I used to be angry about that. A beat. I stopped being angry about it after he died, which is probably the most useless timing possible. Dominic said nothing. But he didn't look away from her either, which she noticed because most people looked away when grief came up, as if not making eye contact with it would prevent it from landing on them. What was his name? Dominic asked. Thomas, she said. Thomas Whitmore. Something happened in his face that she didn't catch because she had looked back down at her plate. A small thing, a flicker, gone almost before it arrived. He sounds like someone worth missing, Dominic said. Claire looked up. Yeah, she said. He really was. The first public appearance was at a charity event in Itaewon 10 days after she moved in. And it was designed, Dominic explained, to be low pressure, 150 guests, people who would circulate the right information to the right places without requiring any particular performance from either of them. Claire wore a black dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion that had cost her a percentage of her monthly budget she preferred not to think about. She'd done her own hair. She'd drawn her own line in the mirror beforehand. She was doing this. She was going to do it well, and she was going to do it as herself, not as a costume of what someone thought she should be. She and Dominic walked in together. The room noticed. That was the point, and she understood it, but understanding a thing and experiencing it are different. She felt the shift, the subtle collective repositioning of attention, the way conversations paused and restarted, the way eyes moved between them calculating something. She kept her spine straight and her expression easy. Dominic put his hand briefly at the small of her back as they crossed the entrance, and she kept herself from reacting to that, with the focused effort of someone who was not, absolutely not, going to give him the satisfaction of knowing it had registered. It had registered 3 hours of conversations she hadn't prepared for, and navigated anyway. A woman who asked her, in English that was clearly designed to unsettle, with whether she found soul overwhelming, and Claire had answered that clarifying, which was true, and watched the woman recalibrate. A man who asked her where she was from, with the particular tone that means what are you doing here? And she had told him Portland, Oregon, with such uncomplicated friendliness that he couldn't find anywhere to put his follow-up. At one point, she found herself in a conversation with 2 of Dominic's associates about a Southeast Asian infrastructure deal and accidentally gave them a better analysis of the financing risk than whoever had briefed them had, which she could tell from the way they looked at each other afterward. Dominic appeared at her elbow about 20 seconds after that conversation ended. You need to stop knowing more than my advisors, he said quietly, close enough that it wasn't public. Tell your advisors to read more, she said just as quietly. She felt, rather than saw, the corner of his mouth move. They left at 11. In the car, the space between them felt different than it had on the way they're less constructed, less careful. She was tired in the real way, not the performance way. You were good tonight, he said. I know, she said, not arrogantly. Just she knew she'd done what the evening required. He looked at her sideways. You're not going to return the compliment, he said. You didn't need to work very hard. Everyone in that room already wanted to tell you what you wanted to hear. That's not a skill, that's just being you. A pause. That might be the most backhanded thing anyone has said to me in years, he said. I mean it constructively. I'm sure you do. She looked out the window at Seoul passing in the dark. The lights. The scale of the city that she still hadn't entirely absorbed even after a year of living inside it. The woman in the green dress, Claire said. Near the bar, around 9 o'clock. What about her? She watched you the entire evening and you didn't acknowledge her once. That didn't seem accidental. He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't. Old problem or current problem? Old. Does she know that? Another pause. Possibly not. Claire nodded once. That's the kind of loose end that turns into something complicated. I'm aware. I'm just saying. I know you are. The car moved through the city, and neither of them said anything else. And Claire thought about the way a room had shifted when she walked into it with him, and what that meant about who he was, and then deliberately stopped thinking about it. The second warning was less ambiguous than the first. She found it in her university mailbox. 4 weeks into the arrangement, a printed photograph of her entering the Serrano building, time-stamped, with a single line, written across the bottom in red ink, "You don't belong there. Leave before you get buried with the rest of them." The rest of them. She stood in the university's mailroom and read that line 3 times. She took the photograph to the nearest bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the sink counter and breathed deliberately for about 2 minutes. In through the nose, out slow. The technique she'd learned at 17 from a track coach who said it was for athletes, but it was really just for humans who needed to stop their hands from shaking. Then she took photographs of the photograph with her phone. Then she went to her seminar. She told Dominic that evening. She showed him the image on her phone. She watched him look at it. His expression didn't shift dramatically. That was the thing about Dominic that she had been so slowly learning. He didn't perform reactions. What happened in his face when something was serious was actually a kind of stillness. Like everything that might normally move went quiet, so the actual processing could happen underneath. The rest of them, he said. That's what I'm focused on too, she said. He set the phone down on the kitchen counter and looked at her. Someone inside my organization is communicating with whoever is doing this. That's what it reads like, which means the information about you, your schedule, your university, your connection to the family came from somewhere with access. Yes, he was quiet. Are you scared? He asked. It wasn't a condescending question. It was a direct one. Yes, she said. Equally direct. Good, he said. You should be. That's honest. He picked up the phone again and looked at the photograph. What did the envelope look like? Standard. No return address. Printed label, not handwritten. The mailbox at my university requires a student ID card to access, which means either someone duplicated a card or someone with legitimate access deposited it. He looked at her. Did you notice any of that, or did someone tell you? He asked. I noticed. Why? Because most people don't look at envelopes after they open them. Most people aren't trying to figure out how something got, where it got. She crossed her arms. What are you going to do? Start pulling on the inside thread, he said. Someone in my organization has been talking. I'm going to find out who. How long will that take? I don't know yet. She didn't like that answer. She could tell, from the way he said it, that he didn't like giving it. In the meantime, he said, You don't go anywhere without Dominic. If you're about to tell me I need an escort to class, we are going to have our first real argument. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided something and doesn't plan to be moved. 2. Plainclothes. You won't see them, and nobody else will see them, but they will be there. That's non-negotiable. This particular item. His voice didn't change volume, but it changed something. I am not... He stopped, started again. This one is not open for adjustment, Claire. She looked at him for a long time. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not authority. Something closer to the inside of something. Something that had the shape of fear, even though she couldn't quite believe that's what it was. Fine, she said. 2. Plainclothes. He nodded. And you tell me immediately if anything else arrives, he said. I don't mean after you've spent a day thinking about it. I mean the day it arrives. Okay. I mean it. I said okay, she said. I don't say things I don't mean. He looked at her steadily. No, he said quietly. I'm learning that. The council meeting happened 6 weeks in. She wasn't supposed to be there. The senior council was not a space where engagements were brought, even fake ones, especially fake ones. But Dominic asked her to be in the building that day, in the adjacent meeting room, working. He didn't explain why, and she didn't push. She sat with her laptop and her notes, and she worked on a trade compliance analysis, and listened to the muffled sound of voices through a wall that was solid but not quite soundproofed enough. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, and Dominic came into the room where she was working, the quality of his silence was different than usual. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything for approximately 45 seconds, which for Dominic Serrano was the equivalent of 3 minutes for another person. How bad? She asked. The council is questioning my fitness to lead, he said. The argument is stability. I'm 34, unmarried, with no designated succession structure. The older faction thinks that makes the organization vulnerable. Because of external perception, or because they actually believe it. Both, and neither. He put his hands flat on the table. Vincent has been working this particular angle for about 2 years. My decision to stay unmarried gave him something concrete to push on. She absorbed that. And the engagement changed that? The engagement is public now. It should quiet the noise for a cycle. But he looked at her. Vincent doesn't accept things that quiet noise, he said. He finds new noise. She thought about the photograph in the mailbox. The rest of them. He's the one feeding information about me, she said. Question. Dominic's jaw tightened. Just barely. I don't have proof of that yet. But the pattern is consistent. Your own uncle, she said. Yes. She let that sit for a moment. What does he want? End goal, what does he actually want? Dominic was quiet for a long time. Vincent has spent 30 years believing he should be running this organization, he said. He made the wrong calculation 25 years ago. Backed the wrong successor. Lost. He's been reconstructing ever since. And you're in his way. I've always been in his way. You gave him a new angle. Claire looked down at her laptop screen. The trade compliance document still open, half finished. The organized, careful, useful life she was trying to build in this city. I'm not a weakness, she said quietly. I know that, Dominic said immediately. Make sure he knows it. He looked at her across the table. He will, he said. The night she figured out the cooking situation was the night something actually shifted. It was 3 weeks after the council meeting, 11:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, and Claire had a seminar response due at 8 the next morning and had forgotten to eat dinner. She went to the kitchen to find something fast and found Dominic already there, standing over a pan with the focused concentration of someone who had decided to attempt something and was not going to admit defeat. Whatever was in the pan smelled like a very confident decision that had made some errors along the way. What is that? She said. Jjigae, he said without looking up. Or it's supposed to be. She leaned over and looked into the pan. It's not. I know it's not. What went wrong? I added the tofu wrong. She stood next to him and looked at the situation for a moment, took the wooden spoon from his hand without asking, and adjusted the temperature on the burner, then stirred twice, and leaned back. When did you learn to cook? She asked. I didn't, he said. I'm trying to. She looked at him sideways. Why? He was quiet for a second. My grandmother used to make this on winter nights when I was a kid. I've been trying to replicate it for about 5 years, and I never get it right. Something in her chest did something she didn't authorize. Lower heat, she said, not making a thing of what he just told her. And you needed to salt the broth earlier. Get me the gochugaru. He got it without comment. They stood in the kitchen for 40 minutes rebuilding the dish. She told him what to adjust and when. He followed instructions with the focused attention of a man who was not accustomed to following instructions, but had decided this particular context merited it. When they ate it at midnight, at the kitchen counter, not the dining table, just the counter. Standing up, it was not quite right. But it was close enough that she saw something happen in his face when he tasted it. Something old and quiet surfacing briefly before he put it away. Better? She asked. Better, he said. She ate her bowl and thought about her father making scrambled eggs on Sunday mornings and how specific a kind of grief it was, missing someone through food. She didn't say that out loud. She didn't have to. Something about the silence in that kitchen at midnight already understood it. The month that followed was the month she stopped counting days. She didn't notice it until later, the gradual erosion of the mental accounting she'd been doing. The way she stopped tracking how many weeks of the 6 months had passed. The way she stopped reminding herself, daily, that this had an end date with contractual clarity. She was busy. That was part of it. Her graduate coursework didn't pause for personal complications, and she had 2 major deliverables in November that demanded a quality of concentration that left room for very little else. She attended 2 more public events with Dominic. She sat in on a business meeting where she caught a contract compliance issue that saved the legal team approximately 3 weeks of retroactive damage troll, which she was told about secondhand by Dominic's chief of staff, a precise woman named Ji Yeon, who had initially looked at Claire with the polite skepticism reserved for people whose presence requires explanation, and had gradually shifted to something that looked almost like respect. Dominic had also quietly begun including her in the actual work, not as a prop, not as a courtesy, as someone whose opinion he wanted in the room before he made certain decisions. She noticed this happening gradually, the way he would turn to her after a presentation, not dramatically, just a glance that asked a question. The way he started texting her specific documents for review, with specific questions attached, questions that had right answers and wrong answers, and he wanted her actual assessment. She gave it, every time. Without softening the parts that were inconvenient, he never pushed back when she was right. That was the thing about him she kept returning to, the thing that didn't fit the profile she'd built before she actually knew him. He had no ego about being wrong. He was deeply invested in being right eventually, but the process of getting there, being shown the error, absorbing it, correcting, he moved through that without drama, without needing to blame something else. She mentioned this to Hai Jin one afternoon over tea, framed carefully as an observation rather than anything else. Hai Jin looked at her with that sharp, patient gaze. He was raised to be afraid of looking weak, Hai Jin said. He decided somewhere along the way that admitting a mistake was not the same thing as looking weak. That was his own conclusion. I didn't give it to him. Who did? Hai Jin considered. I think he gave it to himself. After his father died, a pause, they were very close. And his father was wrong about several important things. Dominic spent a long time deciding what to do with that. Claire thought about Thomas Whitmore being wrong about nothing that she had ever been able to find, and the specific loneliness of the reverse of losing someone you couldn't critique, even in grief, because there wasn't anything to critique. What was his father wrong about? She asked. Hai Jin looked at her. That, she said, is a longer conversation. The night Vincent came for dinner was not announced to Claire in advance. She found out because she came home from the university at 6:30 to find the apartment operating at a different frequency, Mrs. Park moving with a precision that meant something formal. The table set for more than 2 people, and Dominic standing in the living room already dressed, which he was never dressed at 6:30. We have guests, he said. I can see that. She looked at the table. Who? My uncle Vincent. 2 council members. Their wives. She looked at him steadily. When were you going to tell me? I'm telling you now, Dominic. I know. He said it in a way that meant I made a calculation, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. If I'd told you this morning, you would have spent the day preparing, and I wanted you to be exactly as you are, not prepared. She stared at him. That is, she said slowly, both the most manipulative and possibly the most correct thing you could have done. I know that too. I need 20 minutes, she said. You have 15. She changed. She pulled her spine up to its full height in the mirror and looked at herself and thought, okay, fine. You've walked into rooms that didn't want you before. This is just another one. She went out to meet Vincent Serrano. He was shorter than she'd expected, which meant nothing, and she knew it meant nothing, but she noticed it anyway. Silver-haired, well-dressed, with the specific kind of good manners that mean you have spent decades deciding exactly when to deploy them and when to withhold them. He took her hand when Dominic introduced her and held it for 1 beat too long, which was also a decision. Miss Whitmore, he said, in English, for her benefit, which was not for her benefit. We have heard so much about you, Mr. Serrano, she said. What you've heard has been accurate. He smiled. The smile didn't touch his eyes. I'm sure it has, he said. Dinner was a performance, and everyone at the table knew it, and nobody acknowledged it, which was its own kind of performance. The other council members were friendly in the way of people, following a temperature set by someone else. Their wives were pleasant and intermittently genuine, which Claire found she actually appreciated. Vincent asked her questions throughout the meal, careful questions, about her background, her degree, her family, her goals. Each question was wrapped in courtesy and had a sharper question living inside it. She answered the outer question every time and left the inner one unanswered. And she could see him noting this, and she could see that he'd noticed she knew what he was doing. They were, she realized, taking a full accounting of each other. At one point he asked her, with the same pleasant smile, whether she found the adjustment to Korean business culture difficult, given how different American approaches to hierarchy were. I find, she said, that the fundamentals are pretty similar everywhere. People want to know if you're useful, and they want to know if you're honest. The hierarchy part is mostly packaging. A brief silence. Interesting perspective, Vincent said. It's mostly just experience, she said. Dominic, across the table, was looking at a point slightly above his plate. She knew, without looking at him directly, that his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working to stay expressionless. Vincent looked between the two of them, and she saw it just briefly, just a flash, the assessment clicking into place behind his eyes. Whatever he'd come to dinner to determine, he was getting his answer. After the guests left, after the door closed, after the sound of the elevator had faded, Dominic turned to her in the quiet of the hallway. He was testing you, she said. Yes. What was he trying to find out? Dominic was quiet for a moment. Whether you were a distraction, he said, or a threat. She looked at him. Which did he decide? Dominic met her eyes. I think, he said carefully, that he hasn't decided yet, which is worse. She thought it about the way Vincent had held her hand one beat too long. The questions inside the questions. The precision of the pleasant smile. He's going to go looking, she said. Yes. For something on me. Yes. And if he finds something on my father? The words came out before she'd constructed them. She didn't know why she said father, except that something about Vincent's questions had moved in that direction, scraped past something, and she had felt it, even if she couldn't have said why. Dominic looked at her sharply. Why'd you say that? He said. I don't know, she said honestly. He asked a lot of questions about my family, about Thomas, more than once. Dominic's face had gone to that stillness again, the deep kind. Your father worked in Korea, he said. It wasn't quite a question. International trade consulting. He was in Seoul for about 2 years, from what he told me. He was young. He didn't talk about it in detail. She looked at Dominic. Why? Do you know something? No, he said. She studied him. She had gotten better, over the last 2 months, at reading the difference between Dominic's silences. This one was not entirely empty. Dominic. I don't know anything about your father, he said, clearly, but I'm going to find out what Vincent is looking for. She stood in the hallway of the penthouse at midnight and felt, for the first time since this arrangement had begun, that there was something coming that she hadn't accounted for. Something with her father's name on it. Something with her father's name on it. Something buried in this city from 25 years ago, before she was old enough to understand what her father did when he was away. The feeling didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived the way real danger often does, quiet, certain. The feeling didn't leave. Claire had learned to trust that particular sensation, the one that lived just below the sternum. Not quite anxiety, not quite instinct, something older than either of those words. She'd felt it twice before in her life. Once the morning before she got the call about her father, and once in her second year of undergrad when a professor she trusted turned out to be building something ugly behind very presentable credentials. Both times she'd talked herself out of it. Both times she'd been wrong to. She wasn't talking herself out of it this time. She spent the 3 days after Vincent's dinner going through everything she could find about her father's time in Korea. She had very little. Thomas Whitmore had not been a man who documented himself, no social media, obviously. It was the late 90s, but also not much in the way of letters or journals. He'd kept work separate from home with a thoroughness she'd always attributed to professionalism, and now was beginning to reread as something else. Protection, maybe. Compartmentalization. The practiced habit of a man who knew that what he carried in one part of his life could not be allowed to leak into another. What she had, a handful of photographs from the soul, period. Her father in his early 30s, looking thin and tired and occasionally happy. A few postcards he'd sent her mother. One letter, 3 pages, mostly mundane, with a single paragraph near the end that she had read 100 times over the years and never found significant until now. I found something here I wasn't looking for. I'm going to have to decide what to do about it. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I made the decision I could live with. That's all any of us can do. She'd always read that as a reference to her mother, to their marriage, which had been complicated and ultimately didn't survive the distance. Now she sat in the study at the penthouse at 2 in the morning and read it again and felt the paragraph mean something completely different, something I wasn't looking for. Whatever happens, the decision I could live with. She photographed the letter. Then she made a call. Mara Quinn was not someone Claire had known. Long they'd met at a research conference 4 months ago, and Mara was the kind of person who inhabited information the way other people inhabited cities. She knew where everything was. She knew the shortcuts, and she knew which areas were dangerous, without needing to be told. She worked as an independent researcher and archivist, and she had a particular specialty in financial records from the late 90s and early 2000s specifically, international trade documentation, and the paper trails that companies left when they were trying not to leave paper trails. Claire sent her the letter photograph and a brief summary of what she was looking for. Mara called back in 40 minutes. Thomas Whitmore, Mara said without greeting. Consulting works in Seoul. Approximately 1,998 to 2,000. You want to know what he was working on? I want to know if there's anything to find, Claire said. There's always something to find. The question is what state it's in and who's been touching it. A pause. Give me a week. And Claire, don't tell whoever you're living with that you're doing this. Claire looked at the closed door of the study. Why? She said. Because the name Serrano is attached to some of the corporate structures I'm going to be looking at, Mara said. And I'd rather know what I'm working with before you have that conversation. Call ended. Claire sat in the quiet of the study and made herself breathe. She didn't tell Dominic. This was the first thing she'd decided to withhold since moving into the penthouse. She was aware of how that felt not guilty, exactly, but weighted. She was also aware that it was the right call. Mara's caution was not irrational. If Thomas's work had intersected with the Serrano organization in ways Claire didn't yet understand, she needed to know what the intersection was before she walked it into a room with Dominic. She went to class. She finished her paper. She attended a business meeting where she said what she thought, and Dominic looked at her the way he'd started looking at her in those rooms, like she was a fixed point he was navigating by. She had dinner with Hai Jin on a Thursday, and they talked about trade policy and Hai Jin's early life in a way that felt like the older woman was offering something, showing her the rooms of herself she didn't usually open. She was playing 2 versions of her life simultaneously, and it was exhausting, in a way she couldn't explain to anyone. On the 7th day, Mara called. Meet me in person, Mara said. Not your place. Not here. I'll send you a location. The location was a small cafe in Mapogu that Claire had to take 2 subway connections to reach. She told the plainclothes security, who she'd learned the names of, which she suspected slightly unnerved them, that she was meeting a university colleague for coffee and would be 3 hours. One of them, the taller one named Jiho, held eye contact with her for a moment, in the way that meant I have a job, and you are making my job difficult, and she met his gaze pleasantly and went to the subway. Mara was already there when she arrived. Small table corner facing the door. She had a manila folder on the table that she didn't open until Claire sat down, and the person at the next table had moved to the counter to order. Your father, Mara said, was not just a trade consultant. Claire kept her face still. Tell me, she said. He was brought in by the Serrano organization in 1998 to help structure a series of international holding companies. Standard work, routing legitimate trade revenue through an international architecture to minimize tax exposure. Legal, mostly. Or at least not obviously not legal. Mara tapped the folder. But your father was good at his job. Very good. And when you're that good at building the architecture, you see what else is flowing through it. What was flowing through it? Money that didn't start as trade revenue, Mara said flatly. The Serrano organization was using the legitimate trade structures your father built as conduit for financial flows from other operations. He would have started to see it in the documentation. Small discrepancies at first, then larger ones, then patterns that only make sense if you understand what you're actually looking at. Claire's hands were flat on the table. She didn't move them. What did he do, she said. Mara opened the folder. Inside was a photocopy, grainy, aged, clearly scanned from physical paper of what appeared to be a formal report. Korean Government Financial Authority letterhead. A date in early 2000. She couldn't read all of it, but she could read the reference numbers and the title block. He reported it, Mara said, confidentially, to the Korean Financial Regulatory Authority. He documented the original legitimate structure, the deviations, the financial flows, the paper trail, the whole thing. It was a thorough, precise, damning piece of work. Claire stared at the document. Then he came home, she said slowly, and 6 months later, he quit international consulting entirely. He never went back to Korea. Right. Yeah. And the investigation? Mara paused. There was no investigation, she said. The report was filed. It was received. And then it was buried. Buried how? Buried the way things get buried when the right person finds out about them before the wrong people do. Mara turned a page in the folder. There's a reference here. Internal communication. I had to go through 3 layers of archived material to find it to a senior figure within the Serrano organization being made aware of the report and taking steps to contain it. Claire looked at the page. There was a name in the document. She read it twice. Vincent, she said. Vincent Serrano, Mara confirmed. He was the organization's liaison to the regulatory contacts at the time. He found out about your father's report before it went anywhere meaningful. He pulled it, and then Mara turned another page. He made sure Thomas Whitmore's name was attached to a counter-narrative. Theft of confidential financial documentation. Breach of consulting contract. The accusation was never formally filed, but it existed in the internal record. Claire felt the room do something strange. Not spin. More like sharpen suddenly, into a precision that hurt. He framed him, she said. He buried the truth and replaced it with a lie, Mara said carefully. And he did it before your father could go anywhere else with the report. After that, Thomas was discredited within the organization's internal history. Anyone who came looking would find the theft accusation, not the regulatory filing. Claire looked down at the table. Her father had spent the last 19 years of his life, 19 years before the heart attack at 51, carrying something. She understood now what the tiredness had been. Not the travel, not the distance. The weight of knowing what he knew and not being able to do anything about it, and possibly not being able to tell his family why, because telling them would have meant explaining how close he'd come to something very dangerous. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I made the decision I could live with. He had made the right decision and had the right decision destroyed and carried the wreckage of it alone for 2 decades. She was not going to cry in this cafe. He breathed once deliberately. Copies, she said. Already made, Mara said. 4 sets. Different locations. Claire looked up. You anticipated this. I've done this kind of work before, Mara said. When you find something this size, you copy it before you read it all the way through. Because once you read it all the way through, you become a liability to the people it implicates. She closed the folder and pushed it across the table to Claire. What are you going to do? I'm going to confront Dominic, Claire said. He may not know. I know he may not know. And if he does, Claire picked up the folder. Then I'll deal with that, she said, in a voice that was steady in the way that things are steady right before they break. She went back to the penthouse. She was calm on the subway, calm in the elevator. The folder was in her bag, and the bag was on her shoulder, and she kept her breathing even, and her expression neutral because Jiho was in the lobby and she wasn't ready to be read yet. She found Dominic in the living room on a call, standing at the window, looking out at Seoul, the way he did sometimes when he was working through something. He glanced at her when she came in. She sat down on the couch and waited. Call ended. He turned. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there made him end the physical distance between them faster than usual, not rushing, but not slow either. He stood a few feet away and looked at her, with the full attention he gave things when the usual filters had come down. What happened? He said. She set the folder on the coffee table between them. Sit down, she said. He sat. She watched him. read. She didn't narrate it or walk him through it. She just watched his face while he went through the pages, because she had decided on the subway that however he reacted to this in real time, without preparation, would tell her more than anything he said afterward. He read slowly, which meant he was reading carefully, not stalling. He went back to one page, twice the internal communication with Vincent's name. He spent a long time on that page. When he put the folder down, he did not look at her immediately. He looked at the middle distance for approximately 15 seconds. Then he said, "How solid is the sourcing?" "My researcher has originals or provenance-verified copies of every document in that folder," Claire said. "The methodology is clean." "How long has she had access to this?" "She's been working it for a week." She was careful. "Nobody contacted her." He nodded. "Once." "I need to independently verify this," he said. "I know. Not because I don't." "I know," she said again. "Do it. Verify all of it. I'll wait." He looked at her then. "Your father," he said, "was not a thief?" she said. "He found something he wasn't supposed to find, and he did the right thing with it, and your uncle buried him for it." The word uncle sat in the air between them. "I didn't know," Dominic said. She looked at him. She believed him. She had thought, on the subway, about what she would do if she looked at his face when he read those documents and saw recognition rather than discovery. She had thought about it directly and honestly the way she thought about things she didn't want to be true, but needed to be prepared for. She had been ready for recognition. There was none. What she saw in his face was something closer to a man watching a building he thought was solid reveal a crack that went all the way to the foundation. "I know you didn't," she said. "My father," he said slowly. "My father died believing Thomas Whitmore stole from us." He put his hand over his mouth briefly, then took it away. Vincent told him that story. "I was 18 when my father died. I heard that story from Vincent while we were standing at my father's grave. The weight of that settled in the room like something physical. Vincent told a dead man's family a lie about a living man," Claire said quietly. "And the living man spent 20 years not being able to correct it because correcting it would have meant explaining how he knew what he knew." Dominic stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her. His hands were at his sides. She could see, from across the room, the tension in his shoulders, not the controlled tension of Dominic in a business meeting or Dominic managing a negotiation, but something rawer, something that was working to contain itself and not entirely succeeding. "He knew," Dominic said, not loud. "He's known for 25 years. He came to dinner in my house last week and sat across the table from you and—" He stopped. The silence was loud. "Yes," Claire said. Dominic turned around. She had not seen his face like this before. She had seen it still, and she had seen it careful, and she had seen it twice, briefly unguarded in the kitchen at midnight or in a quiet conversation with Hai Jin. She had not seen it like this. Something had broken in the careful architecture of his expression, and what was underneath was not exactly anger, though anger was there. It was something older. The face of a man realizing that a grief he'd already finished grieving had been built on a lie. "I'm going to verify this today," he said. His voice was controlled. The rest of him was not quite. "Every document, every source. I have access to the original corporate archive from that period. I'm going to pull every record that touches this, and I'm going to have Eleanor Cho authenticate them." "Eleanor Cho," Claire said. "Senior financial director. She's been with the organization for 30 years. She predates Vincent's influence. If anyone can tell me these documents are real without going through a channel Vincent has access to, it's her." "How long?" 2 days. "Maybe 3. Claire nodded. In the meantime, he said, "You don't tell Vincent anything. You don't change how you behave around him. If he contacts you, you treat it as normal. I know how to manage that. I know you do." He looked at her steadily. "I know you do, Claire. I'm saying it because I need to say something useful right now, and that is the most useful thing I can think of." She looked at him. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "Vincent came to that dinner to assess me," she said. "We established that. But I think the assessment wasn't just about whether I was a distraction or a threat in general. I think he came to see how much I knew about my father's time here." Dominic was very still. "You think he already suspects you found something? I think he's been watching for it. The threats, the photograph, the scholarship records. That wasn't just about removing me from your life. It was about removing me from this city before I started asking the right questions. She paused. Timing matters. He started the pressure campaign right around the time I began appearing at family events. When he realized I wasn't just a foreign student, I was a foreign student who knew how to move through financial documentation. Dominic sat back down, not across from her, beside her, close enough that she could see the details of his expression without effort. You figured this out, he said. My researcher figured out the documents. I figured out the motive. Same thing. Not really. He shook his head slightly. I've had senior investigators on my payroll for a decade who didn't put that together. Your senior investigators don't have a personal reason to look in that particular direction, she said. I do. A long silence. I owe your father something, Dominic said. You owe him the truth, she said. That's all. Just the truth. The verification took 2 days. Eleanor Cho was a woman in her early 60s who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the bearing of someone who had survived several organizational revolutions by being indispensable and impossible to rattle. Dominic brought her the documents privately, framed as a historical audit question, and she took them without asking for an explanation he hadn't offered. She called him 36 hours later. Claire was in the study when he came to find her. She looked up from her laptop. She read the answer in his face before he said a word. It's all authentic, he said. Eleanor cross-referenced the original corporate archive. The trade structures your father built are in there. The financial deviations are in there. The internal communication from Vincent. He stopped. She found the original, not a copy. The original document with Vincent's handwriting in the margin. Claire closed her laptop. What does it say? She said. The margin note. Dominic looked at her. Handle this before it reaches the second level, he said. And then, in a different pen, a different visit. A different day, just one word. He paused. Done, 1 word. 25 years. Her father's reputation. Dominic's father's belief. The whole constructed history of a lie that had been told to everyone who mattered. Done. She stood up. What are you going to do? She said. I'm going to call a council meeting, Dominic said. Vincent will be there, yes. He'll have 25 years of defensive preparation. I know. He'll come at me, she said. The moment the evidence goes on the table, he'll come at me. He'll make it about why I have this, how I got it, what my motive is. He'll reframe the whole thing. He'll try, Dominic said. Dominic. She looked at him directly. You have to be ready for what that room is going to ask you. Not about the evidence. About me. About why you believe me over your uncle. About whether this is a woman you've known for 3 months manipulating you into destroying your own family. He held her gaze without flinching. I know what they're going to ask, he said. Then I need to know your answer before we walk in there, she said. Not the answer you'll give the council. Your answer. The one that's true, whether or not it's useful. A long moment. He looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing more of. Recently, the one that lived below the surface of the careful, managed face he showed most rooms. The one that was just him, without the construction around it. You're the most honest person I've been in a room with in 10 years, he said. Maybe longer. And I spent 25 years believing my father died, knowing the truth about what happened in this organization. And you've just showed me he didn't. He paused. That's my answer. She nodded. Okay, she said. Then let's do this right. They spent that night building the presentation of evidence. Not together, only Mara was brought in. Securely, and Eleanor Cho was read in fully, and Dominic's chief of staff, Ji Yan, worked until 3 a.m. cross-referencing and sequencing and making sure every document was traceable and every argument was airtight. Claire sat at the center of it, organizing the logical architecture. Because that was what she did. She saw the argument inside the evidence and built the clearest path from premise to conclusion. She felt, working through the night, the specific alive quality of doing something that mattered beyond the project itself. Not performing, not managing perceptions, just doing the actual thing, the hard necessary thing, with people who were equally committed to doing it right. Around 2 a.m, Mara arrived with something additional, a bank record from 2001. A count in a name that didn't match any current member of the organization, but which Eleanor, looking at it for approximately 45 seconds, identified as a structure that had been closed years ago. The account had received a transfer in the spring of 2000, a significant one. After your father filed, Mara said to Claire. 2 months after. What is this account connected to? Claire asked Eleanor. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Vincent's personal financial network, she said, indirectly. 2 layers removed. But I know the structure. I built part of it. She said that last sentence in a voice that contained something Claire couldn't fully interpret, not quite guilt, not quite anger. Something that had been waiting a long time to become something else. Paid, Eleanor said, for burying the report. The room was silent. By whom? Dominic said. Eleanor looked at him across the table. By the counterparties whose money was in the FLOFA your father documented, she said. The organizations on the other end of the financial corridor. The ones who needed Vincent to make sure the regulatory filing went nowhere. She slid the bank record into the evidence sequence. That's not just complicity, Dominic said. No, Eleanor said quietly. That is a man who sold your family's name for money and then spent 25 years pretending he was protecting it. The council meeting was called for a Thursday. Vincent arrived, looking exactly as he always looked, controlled, silver, precisely dressed. He took his seat at the table with the ease of a man who had occupied powerful rooms for so long that he'd stopped noticing them. He noticed Claire. She saw it the fraction of a second when he walked in and found her already seated at the table, and his face did something very small and very cold before the pleasant expression reasserted itself. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. The room filled. 12 council members. Ji-yeon in the corner with documents. Eleanor Cho at the far end of the table, expressionless. Dominic stood. He didn't preamble. He didn't build toward it. He put the evidence on the table, and he began to speak, and the room shifted almost immediately, the way rooms shift when something that has been underground begins breaking the surface. Vincent's face changed by degrees, the pleasantness first, then the controlled neutrality, then something harder coming up underneath, something that had the shape of calculation running very fast. When Dominic stopped speaking, Vincent looked down the table, not at Dominic, at Claire. This, he said, is what she brought to you. The evidence stands, regardless of its source, Dominic said. The evidence, Vincent said, was assembled by a woman who has been in this family for 3 months, who had access to historical records she should never have been able to find, and who has a clear motivation to rewrite the history of her father's conduct within this organization. He opened his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. I'm not saying she fabricated these documents. I am saying she found documents and constructed a narrative. The interpretation is hers. The framing is hers. And he looked at Dominic. You have allowed a personal relationship to compromise your judgment about a matter that affects every person in this room. Several council members shifted. Claire watched their faces. She could see the pull of it, the more familiar authority, the longer relationship, the simpler explanation. The original document with your handwriting in the margin, Dominic said. Do you deny writing it? A pause. Documents from 25 years ago. Do you deny writing it? Dominic said again. Vincent looked at him. Something passed between them. Not affection, not family. Something much older and colder than either of those things. I was protecting this organization, Vincent said. Thomas Whitmore was going to expose financial structures that would have brought regulatory attention to every legitimate operation we had built. I contained the damage. That is what I was paid to do. You were paid, Dominic said, by the counterparties. A beat of silence. To contain the damage, Vincent said, as if the distinction didn't exist. You took money, Dominic said, from the people on the other end of the illegal financial corridor. You took their money to bury the report that documented their money. And then you told my father that Thomas Whitmore was a thief. Vincent held his nephew's gaze. Your father was going to make an emotional decision, he said. I gave him a version of events he could act on. The room had gone completely still. Claire looked at Vincent Serrano across the table and understood with a clarity that felt almost cold that she was looking at a man who had spent 25 years being the smartest person in every room he'd entered and had just for the first time run out of angles. And then he did the thing she hadn't seen coming. He turned to Dominic, and his voice dropped lower, became something almost private, even in a room with 12 witnesses. You want to burn this family down, he said. For a woman you met 3 months ago. Think about what you're doing. Think about your father. Think about what he built and why. You are about to hand everything he spent his life protecting to investigators because this woman showed you a story she assembled about a father she barely knew. Claire felt the air in the room change. She looked at Dominic. She watched it land the reference to his father, the precision of it, the way Vincent had found the exact bruise press, and pressed it with 25 years of knowledge about exactly how hard to press. She watched Dominic's face absorb it, and she watched him hesitate. It was less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds is nothing. 3 seconds in a conversation is barely a breath. But Claire had been watching Dominic's face for 3 months in business meetings and over midnight jigay and across tables in rooms full of people who wanted things from him. She knew what his hesitation looked like, and she knew what it cost him. And she knew, watching those 3 seconds, that they were 3 seconds of Vincent's words finding the place inside Dominic where his father still lived. I need time to... Dominic started, and Claire stood up. She didn't make a speech. She didn't raise her voice. She reached for the folder in front of her, straightened her jacket with 2 small, precise movements, and looked at Dominic across the table. He was already looking at her. He saw it. She knew he saw it, because his expression changed the moment she made eye contact. The thing he saw in her face was not anger. It was something quieter than anger and harder than anger. And she had worn it before in her life, in other rooms, when other people made choices about her that they shouldn't have been making. She had given him the truth. She had laid 25 years of buried evidence on a table in front of 12 people. And when Vincent Serrano pushed, Dominic had asked for time. She didn't say any of that. She didn't need to. She looked at him for exactly long enough for him to understand every word of it. Then she straightened the folder under her arm, picked up her bag, and walked out of the room. The door didn't slam. She wasn't theatrical about it. She simply walked through it into the corridor and kept walking, her steps steady and even and deliberate, all the way to the elevator, and she stood in the elevator going down and looked at the floor and breathed. Her hands were completely steady. Her chest was not. She walked out of the building into the cold Seoul afternoon and stood on the pavement and thought, he had everything he needed, and he still hesitated. She thought about her father sitting in this city 25 years ago, finding something he wasn't supposed to find, making the decision he could live with, and having that decision buried under a lie by a man who calculated the cost of everything and the value of nothing. She thought about the 3 seconds. She started walking. She didn't know yet where she was going, only that it was forward, and that she was going there alone, and that the truth was still in the folder under her arm, regardless of what any room full of powerful men decided to do about it. The evidence existed. Mara had copies. Eleanor Cho had authenticated them. Vincent's margin note said done in a handwriting that would not wash out of the record, now regardless of how much money changed hands, or how many rooms went silent, or how many men who should have spoken chose instead to ask for. She walked for 40 minutes before she stopped. Not because she was tired, because she reached the Han River, and there was nowhere further to walk without getting wet, and she stood at the railing, looking at the water, and let herself feel the full weight of the last 3 hours, without trying to manage it into something smaller. The wind off the river was sharp. Her coat wasn't heavy enough for it. She gripped the railing with both hands and focused on the cold of the metal until her breathing evened out into something functional. 3 seconds. She kept coming back to 3 seconds. The measured, rational part of her brain, the part that had gotten her through a scholarship application at 22 and a cross-Pacific move at 26 and 11 months of graduate school, in a country where she still occasionally dreamed in English, and woke up confused, that part said, 3 seconds is nothing. 3 seconds is a man absorbing a calculated emotional attack from someone who has spent 25 years learning how to deliver it. 3 seconds is not a verdict. The other part of her, the part that lived below the sternum, the part that had felt the danger before Vincent's dinner, and the danger in the hallway, and the danger in every warning that had come her way since September, that part said, you showed him who you were for 3 months, and the first time it cost him something. He paused. She knew both of those things could be true simultaneously. She was not quite ready to be rational about it yet. Her phone rang. Dominic. She watched the screen until it stopped. It rang again. She let it stop again. The third time it rang, she answered. Where are you? He said. His voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard before, not the controlled tightness of a business negotiation, something rawer underneath it. Han River, she said. Mapo Bridge area, a pause. Are you? I'm fine, she said. I'm standing at the railing looking at the water. I'm not doing anything dramatic. I didn't think you were. Then why did you pause before asking? He didn't answer that. Come back, he said. Not tonight. Claire, I need tonight, she said. You can have an argument with me tomorrow. Tonight I need to be somewhere that isn't that building. A long silence on his end. She could hear ambient sound. He was somewhere inside. Probably the hallway off the main meeting room, probably standing the way he stood when he was trying to contain something. I ended the meeting, he said. She waited. I told Vincent to leave. I told the council I was tabling the matter, pending a complete independent review of the evidence. I told Eleanor Cho to begin that review immediately, and to report only to me. He paused. And I told Vincent that until the review is complete, he is not to contact anyone on the council, contact you, or enter the building. She looked at the river. That's not the same as what you should have said in the room, she said. I know that. Then why didn't you say it in the room? The silence lasted long enough that she almost thought the call had dropped. Because he mentioned my father, Dominic said. And for 3 seconds, I was 18 years old, standing at a grave, and I couldn't. He stopped. It doesn't excuse it. No, she said, it doesn't. I know. She breathed in the cold air. The river moved below her, indifferent and steady. I'll be back tomorrow morning, she said. I'm going to stay with Mara tonight. Mara's office isn't Mara's apartment, she said, which you don't have the address for, and I would prefer you didn't obtain it through whatever means you have for obtaining addresses. A pause. Jiho will be in the area, he said. I figured. Claire, his voice changed. Not dramatic, just unguarded briefly, the way it went in the kitchen at midnight. I'm sorry, she closed her eyes for 1 second. I know, she said. Tomorrow, she hung up. She stood at the river for another 10 minutes. Then she called Mara. Mara's apartment was in Sio de Mungu, small and warm and organized, with the precise chaos of someone who lived surrounded by information and had made peace with it. Books stacked on books. Documents filed in systems that would appear random to anyone who hadn't built them. A cat named Euler who looked at Claire with the placid authority of an animal who had assessed her and found her acceptable. Mara made rice and kimchi jjigae, the real kind. The kind that had been sitting on low heat long enough to develop, and they ate at the small kitchen table and didn't talk about the council meeting for the first 20 minutes. Then Mara said he hesitated. Yes, and you left. Yes. Mara looked at her over her bowl. Was that the right call? Claire thought about it genuinely. The way she tried to think about things she'd already done when she wasn't sure about them, without defending herself, without explaining, just looking at the actual thing. I don't know, she said. It was the honest call. Those aren't always the same thing. I know. She moved rice around her bowl. But I've spent my whole adult life being strategic about when to push back and when to let things go. Being the foreigner who picks her battles. Being the woman who chooses the right moment to speak. And I put 25 years of evidence on a table, and he asked for time, and I was just... She stopped. I was done being strategic about it. Mara nodded slowly. The copies are safe, she said, all for sets. Distributed this morning after I left the building. Claire looked up. Before the meeting. I don't wait for outcomes. Mara took another bite. Vincent can go looking for the originals. He can try to pull the archive documents. He's already too late. Something settled in Claire's chest. Not comfort, exactly. More like a foothold. He's going to come after me directly, Claire said. Now that the meeting happened, and he knows what I have. He's not going to wait for Dominic's review. Probably not, Mara agreed. What would he offer? Mara considered this. Money first. That's how he's operated, historically financial settlement as the first option. If that doesn't work, escalation. She paused. You're safer tonight than you'd think. He's still calculating. He won't move before he has a clear line. How long does he calculate for? Vincent Serrano? Mara said. He'll make contact within 48 hours. It was 36. Call came to her personal cell at 11 the following morning. She was back at the penthouse she'd returned at 8, found Dominic already at work, exchanged exactly 6 words with him. Coffees on thank you, and taken her laptop to the study. The conversation they needed to have was waiting. Neither of them had decided it was time yet. The number on her screen was private. she answered. Miss Whitmore, said Vincent Serrano, I wonder if we might speak privately. His voice was the same as it had been at dinner, pleasant, measured, the absolute minimum of pressure visible in it. We're speaking now, she said. In person would be better. I'm sure it would. She kept her voice neutral. What would you like to say, Mr. Serrano? A brief pause. He was adjusting. She could tell he'd planned for reluctance, probably, maybe for a brief performance of considering before agreeing. She was cutting past all of it. You're an intelligent young woman, he said. You've built something from nothing. A scholarship, a graduate degree, a future you've fought very hard for. I respect that. She said nothing. The situation you've placed yourself in, he continued, carries consequences that I don't believe you've fully mapped. The evidence you have, regardless of its authenticity, implicates structures that go well beyond my personal conduct. There are parties involved who have resources and inclinations that are not as measured as mine. Is that a threat? It's an accounting, he said smoothly, of the reality you're navigating. What do you want, Mr. Serrano? I want you to walk away, he said, simply, cleanly. Leave Korea. Take your degree if you're close enough. Or transfer the credits to an American institution. I can facilitate that. And I will provide you with enough financial security that you will never have to fight for a scholarship again. The number he named was significant. She wrote it down on the notepad next to her laptop, not because she needed to, but because writing it meant she had a record of this conversation in her own handwriting. Think about it, she said. Of course. He was already pleasant again. He'd expected this. I'll give you until Friday. He ended the call. She stared at the notepad. Then she went to find Dominic. He was in the main office off the living room, on a call, and she stood in the doorway until he looked at her and saw her face and ended the call mid-sentence. Vincent just called me, she said. She held up the notepad with the number on it. He made an offer. Dominic looked at the number. Something moved through his face that she had no clean word for, not surprise, more like the feeling of a suspicion confirmed at a scale larger than anticipated. He moved fast, Dominic said. Mara said 48 hours. He made it 36. She put the notepad on his desk. He mentioned other parties. Said they had resources and inclinations less measured than his. He's trying to scare you. He's succeeding somewhat, she said honestly. That doesn't mean it's going to change what I do. She looked at him. I told him I'd think about it. Good. I'm going to call Mara in the next hour and make sure the 5th set of copies goes somewhere I haven't used before. Somewhere he genuinely cannot reach. I'll have Eleanor begin the formal authentication documentation today, Dominic said. If we're going to move on this, I want every document legally certified before Vincent can challenge the chain of custody. How long for the authentication? 2 days. He gave me until Friday. Then we have 2 days. They looked at each other across the desk. It was not 3 months ago. 3 months ago, she had stood in a graduate school hallway and told him she wouldn't leave Seoul for anyone, and he had been a man whose face she was still learning. Now, she knew the specific way his jaw set when he was managing something difficult, and he knew the way she got very still, rather than agitated when the actual stakes arrived. And somewhere between midnight jjigae and burned dinners and business meetings, and a river railing in the cold, the distance between them had become a different kind of distance, not less real, but different in character. About what happened in the meeting room, he said. We don't have to. I want to. He looked at her directly. I am not my father. I spent years making sure I wasn't my father, not because he was a bad man, but because he made his decisions based on what he was afraid of losing, and I swore I wouldn't do that. And then Vincent said 2 sentences about him, and I did exactly the thing I swore I wouldn't do. She was quiet. I'm not looking for absolution, he said. I'm telling you what happened because you deserve to know it. I know what happened, she said. I was watching. I know you were. She looked at him. Don't do it again, she said. No, he said. I won't. The authentication was running. The 5th copies were secured. Eleanor Cho was working through the night with 2 associates Claire had never met and trusted entirely because Eleanor vouched for them, and Eleanor had proven herself 12 times over. And then, on Thursday morning, everything moved at once. Mara called at 7:43. Someone hit my office last night, she said. Her voice was level in the way that meant she was working hard to keep it level. Broken around 2 a.m. Filing system torn apart. Electronics taken. Claire was already standing. The copies. Not there. Never there. But Claire Mara paused. They took my research notes, the handwritten ones. Preliminary methodology from when I first started pulling the Serrano financial records. It doesn't have the documents, but it has the names of the archives I accessed. If they're smart enough to read those notes, they can try to corrupt the originals before Eleanor finishes authentication, Claire said. Yes. She was already moving toward the door. Are you safe? I'm not at the office. I wasn't there when it happened. A beat. I had a feeling last night. I slept at a hotel. Stay there. Don't go back to your office. I'm calling you back in 10 minutes. She found Dominic in the hallway. She told him in 30 seconds. She watched his face shift into the mode she'd seen in meetings when something had moved from theoretical to active, the stillness, becoming a different kind of stillness, purposeful rather than contained. He made 3 calls in rapid sequence. The first was to his head of security. The second was to Eleanor. The third she didn't hear because she was on her phone with Mara, working out where the research notes referenced. How many archives? She asked Mara. 4. But only 2 of them would have the originals Vincent would need to corrupt. Which 2? Mara told her. She walked back to Dominic and told him while he was still on with Eleanor. She watched him relay it to Eleanor, watched Eleanor's response register in his face. Whatever Eleanor said was fast and certain. Eleanor can contact both archives this morning, he said when the call ended. Request emergency authentication locks on the relevant files. It's a formal legal process. She can do it through her regulatory contacts. It'll take about 6 hours to fully process, but it'll be flagged immediately. Can Vincent counter that? Not quickly. Not legally. But not legally isn't a constraint he's demonstrating right now, Claire said. No, Dominic said. It's not. His security chief was already in the building. There was a conference in the hall outside the office that Claire was not quite part of and did not try to be. She sat in the office and worked the problem. She could work, which was the documentary sequence, making sure the evidence package Eleanor was authenticating was ordered to withstand the specific counter-arguments Vincent had made in the council room. She was 40 minutes into that when Gian appeared in the doorway. Miss Whitmore. Gion's voice was completely flat, in the way that meant it was being kept flat deliberately. Jiho is asking for you. Claire followed Gian to the security office. Jiho was looking at a monitor with the fixed attention of someone deciding how to say something. Your researcher, he said. She went back to her office. I told her not to. 40 minutes ago, Jiho said. She said she needed something she forgot. She went in. The 2 men who did the break-in last night were still watching the building. Claire felt her stomach drop. Where is she now? She said. Our people are on the way. But Miss Whitmore. He turned to look at her, and his expression was professional and steady, and also not quite concealing something. Called from inside the office. She's with them. Everything went very quiet inside Claire's head. How many? She said. 2. Our people will arrive, and he checked. 8 minutes. She's been in there for 40 minutes already. Yes. She turned around and walked back to the main office. Was still on a call. She walked in, stood in front of him, and waited until he looked at her face and ended the call. Vincent's men have Mara, she said, at her office. Your security team is 8 minutes out. He was already standing. The next 4 minutes were organized chaos of the kind that operated on its own logic. Security chief back in the room, positions established, the car moving while decisions were still being finalized. Dominic told her to stay in the building twice. She didn't respond either time and got in the car. He didn't physically stop her. In the car, he looked at her. You understand, he said carefully, that walking into this situation, she's there because of me, Claire said. She's in that building because she was helping me. I'm not staying in a penthouse 40 floors up while that's happening. His jaw was tight. Stay behind Jiho, he said. Yes. Not near behind. I heard you. Car moved through Seoul traffic, and she sat with her hands in her lap and counted her breathing, and did not look at Dominic, because looking at him right now felt like a thing she couldn't afford. Too much information going in too many directions, and she needed every clear channel for what was coming. They were 6 minutes out when her phone rang. Private number. She looked at Dominic. He nodded. She answered. I hope, Vincent said, that you've used the time since our conversation productively. Not unpleasant. Not overtly threatening. Just Vincent doing what Vincent did. which was apply pressure so precisely that it didn't sound like pressure until you were already under it. I have someone with me who would very much like to go home. Let her go, Claire said. She has nothing you need. She has methodology notes that implicate records. I'd rather not have formally authenticated, he said. And she has a working relationship with you that I'd rather not have continue. A pause. My offer to you stands. With an amendment. You agree by tonight instead of Friday. You make a call to whoever is managing the authentication process, and you end it, and your colleague goes home. The car was still moving. She looked at the window at Sol going past. She thought about Mara's voice on the phone 40 minutes ago, steady and controlled, saying I had a feeling last night, the particular caution of a woman who had spent a career inside sensitive information, and knew what it felt like when it turned on you. I need to speak to her, Claire said. A brief pause. Then Mara's voice thin, tight, working at the same steadiness she always worked at. I'm okay, Mara said. The notes don't. The line went back to Vincent. Well, he said. I'll call you back in 2 minutes, Claire said. You have one. She ended the call. She looked at Dominic. He wants me to pull the authentication and agree to leave Korea, she said. In exchange for Mara, how long? 1 minute. She looked at him. What's our ETA? 3 minutes. That's 2 minutes too long. I know. If I call back and stall, he'll know you're stalling. I know he'll know. She thought fast. But if I tell him I need more time to reach the authentication contact, it buys us something. 48 hours for a regulatory authentication lock is legitimate, he knows that. He might believe I need time to make the call. Dominic was already looking at Jiho. Something passed between them, some compressed communication that operated in the register she still didn't have full access to. Make the call, Dominic said. 2 minutes. She called back. I'll pull the authentication, she said. But I need 40 minutes to reach Eleanor Cho and walk her through ending the process without flagging it to the archives. If I do this wrong, it triggers an automatic audit, and that's worse for everyone. Pause. 30 minutes, Vincent said. 30 minutes, she agreed. The line went dead. The car stopped. They were on a street in Mapogu, and Mara's office building was visible from the window, a narrow 4-story building, older, between a dry cleaning business and a convenience store. Unremarkable. The kind of building nobody looked at twice. Dominic's security team was already outside. 3 men in plainclothes, positioned at angles she clocked in about 5 seconds. Jiho was out of the car before it fully stopped. Dominic turned to her. You stay in the car until Jiho gives the signals, he said. Dominic, Claire. His voice had dropped to something very quiet. If something goes wrong in there and you're inside, I cannot. He stopped. Please. She looked at him. The please was not Dominic Serrano managing a situation. The please was something underneath all of that, asking in the only way it knew how. Car, she said. Until the signal. He got out. She watched through the window as the team moved coordinated, unhurried in a way that was actually the opposite of unhurried, just precise enough that the urgency wasn't visible from the street. Dominic moved with them. She had not, in 3 months, seen him in a situation that required this particular version of himself, and she understood watching it why the man he was inside the penthouse, the midnight kitchen, follow the cooking instructions, listen for an hour version, was so carefully separated from whatever this was. 3 minutes she counted. At minute 4, the ground floor light in the building changed. At minute 5, Jiho appeared in the doorway of the building. He looked directly at the car and gave a small nod. She got out. The inside of the building smelled like old paper and heating oil, and she took the stairs because the elevator was too slow, following Jiho up 2 flights. And when she came through the door into Mara's office, she took in the room in pieces the destruction of the filing system, boxes pulled and overturned, the desk lamp knocked sideways, and then Mara, sitting in her own office chair with her arms crossed over her chest and an expression that walked a narrow line between shaken and absolutely furious. 2 men were against the wall. Dominic's security had them. They were not speaking and not looking at anyone. Mara looked at Claire. I told you I had it handled, Mara said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, which was the only crack in the whole sentence. You called from inside a building with 2 men in it, Claire said. I was getting my laptop, Mara. I know. She exhaled. I know. I'm sorry. She looked around at the wreckage of her office. These are my records. 20 years of work. I didn't want them to. She stopped. Something shifted in her face. anger consolidating into something harder. I photographed the notes before I left last night, the ones they took. I had a feeling. Claire looked at her. You photographed everything. I had a feeling, Mara said again, quieter. Claire crossed the room, sat on the edge of the overturned desk, and for a moment put her hand briefly on Mara's shoulder. Not a hug, not a performance, just a human acknowledgement that Mara accepted with a small nod. Dominic was on his phone in the corner of the room. She could hear the tone of it controlled, low, directing something remotely. When he came off the call, he looked at Claire across the destroyed office. Vincent is going to know we're here in approximately 10 minutes, he said. When he realizes I'm not calling Eleanor, she said. Yes. Then we have 10 minutes to decide the next move before he makes his. The authentication is still running, Dominic said. Eleanor flagged the archives 2 hours ago. Vincent's people took research notes, but not the documents they were trying to protect. The originals are already locked. She absorbed this. He doesn't know that, she said. Not yet. And when he finds out, the leverage disappears. He has Mara, but Mara's safe. He has a deadline that I've just run out the clock on. He has nothing to threaten me with that I haven't already accounted for. Dominic looked at her steadily. Which means, she said, he's going to go to the press. Yes, his version first. His framing. Leak enough about the evidence to get ahead of it. Spin Thomas as before the authentication is complete. Make the investigation about my motives before it's about his conduct. He has contacts, Dominic said. 2 major financial reporters. He's been cultivating them for years. How long before he calls them? Dominic checked his phone. If he realizes the authentication is locked and his deadline passed. He looked up. An hour. Maybe less. The room was very quiet. Outside, Sol was doing what Sol did, enormous and indifferent, and moving at a speed that didn't pause for the things happening in a small, destroyed office on the 2nd floor of an unremarkable building in Mapo-gu. Claire looked at Mara. Can you be ready to release the evidence to independent outlets in the next 45 minutes? Mara looked back at her. I've been ready since yesterday morning, she said. Claire looked at Dominic. If we release first, she said, Vincent's version becomes the response. The story leads with your family's financial history, Thomas Whitmore's regulatory filing, the suppression of that filing, and Vincent's signed documentation. The authentication supports it, but the story exists without it. It implicates the organization, Dominic said. Not just Vincent. I know. It opens a formal government investigation. I know that too. He looked at her. The full weight of what they were talking about was in the room between them, not abstract anymore, not a strategy discussion, the actual thing. The criminal architecture his family had built over decades, the legitimate companies built over and through it, the empire that his grandfather had started and his father had expanded, and that Dominic had spent 10 years running, with the belief that he was making it something other than what it fundamentally was. Your call, she said. Not mine, this is your family. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, it was my family, he said. It became my empire. And Vincent showed me last week, in front of 12 people, exactly what that empire has been protecting. She waited. Make the call to Mara, he said. I'm going to call Eleanor and tell her to release the authentication documentation at the same time. Something released in the room. Not relief. Not yet that required a future that hadn't arrived yet. Something more like the feeling of a decision becoming real. She nodded once. Then she looked at the 2 men against the wall. What happens to them, she said. Dominic looked at them. They didn't look back. They had the posture of men who had calculated their options and found them limited. They're going to answer some questions, he said. And then they're going to be very helpful to investigators who are about to become very interested in everything Vincent has been doing for 25 years. Mara was already on her laptop, working fast, pulling up the distribution list she'd built and never sent. Dominic was on his phone, voice low and precise, Eleanor on the other end. And Claire stood in the wreckage of Mara's office in Mapo-gu and felt the specific weight of a moment, just before everything changes, the last second of the held breath. The last instant of the world being the shape it had always been. Right before someone pressed send, and it became. Mara pressed send at 11:47 a.m. on a Thursday in November. It wasn't dramatic. It was a keystroke. The kind of small physical action that carries enormous consequence. and feels entirely inadequate to that consequence, a finger moving less than a centimeter, and then the thing was done, and the world it landed in was already different from the world that had existed 11 milliseconds before. 5 independent financial journalists received the package simultaneously, Korean outlets and 2 international ones. The documentation was organized the way Claire had built it, chronological, sourced, with Eleanor's authentication certificates attached to each primary document. There was a cover letter that Mara had written, and Claire had edited twice. That did not editorialize, did not make arguments, did not ask for anything. It simply presented what the documents were, where they came from, and what they demonstrated. Let the evidence speak. That was the principle Thomas Whitmore had operated on 25 years ago when he filed a regulatory report he believed would be read and acted on. He had been wrong about that. His daughter was going to try again with the same principle and considerably more copies. Dominic ended his call with Eleanor. He looked at Mara's screen for a moment, the sent confirmation, the timestamp, the list of recipients. "It's done," he said. "Yes," Claire said. They stood in the destroyed office in Mapogu, and neither of them said anything else for a moment. Outside Seoul was still Seoul enormous and indifferent, and 10 million people moving through their Thursday, with no awareness that something had just shifted in a small room above a dry cleaning shop. Jiho appeared in the doorway. "We should move." Dominic nodded. He looked at the 2 men still against the wall. They had not moved, had not spoken, had operated with the patience of people waiting for whatever came next, and not wasting energy fighting what they couldn't change. "Take them separately," Dominic said to Jiho. "Do not allow them to communicate before we have everything we need." Jiho confirmed it with a look. Dominic turned to Mara. "You need to be somewhere else today. Not a hotel you've used before, not your apartment." "I have options," Mara said. She was already closing her laptop, methodical, snapping the case shut, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had known this moment was coming and had made her arrangements. She looked at Claire. "I'll be reachable. Don't disappear on me." "I won't," Claire said. Mara looked at her for a long moment. Something passed between them that wasn't sentiment exactly. It was the look of 2 women who had done a difficult thing together, and each knew the exact weight the other had carried. "Your father would have been—" Mara started. "Don't," Claire said quietly. "Not unkindly. Not yet. Let it land first." Mara nodded. She picked up her bag and her laptop, and she left. The first story broke at 1:15 p.m. Claire and Dominic were back at the penthouse when Ji-yeon came in with her tablet and set it on the conference table without a word, just turned it so they could see the screen. Korean financial outlet Major 1. The kind of publication that did not run stories without verification and had clearly spent the 90 minutes since receiving the package doing exactly that. The headline was clean and devastating and took no position it didn't have documents to support. She read it twice. Dominic read it once. His phone started ringing at 1:18. He let the first 3 calls go. The 4th was a council member named Park Sung-jin, and Dominic answered that one and took it into the side office, and she heard, through the wall, not words but cadence, the long silences on Dominic's end that meant he was listening to something complicated and deciding how to respond. She sat at the conference table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and looked at her own phone. Diana had texted from Portland, a news alert, had apparently surfaced in English already. Some aggregator had picked it up. Diana's message was, "Claire, I'm seeing your dad's name in Korean financials news. What is happening?" Claire started typing a response and stopped, and started again and stopped. She would call Diana tonight. She would explain everything tonight. Some conversations needed a voice, not a text chain. The second story broke at 2:40 p.m. International outlet. This one had reached Eleanor for comment. Eleanor had referred them to a prepared statement that she and Dominic had drafted at 6 in the morning the previous day. The contingency document, the one neither of them had said out loud they were building, but both of them had known they were building. The statement acknowledged the evidence, confirmed the authentication, and announced that the Serrano group was cooperating with a formal review. Not cooperating with investigators. Not yet. Cooperating with a formal review. The language mattered. It was the language of a family choosing to open a door before someone kicked it in. At 3:30, Vincent's lawyer issued a statement calling the documents fabricated and the sourcing compromised. It was the expected move, and it was already too late. The authentication certificates were attached to every package. And Eleanor Cho's professional record was 30 years of impeccability that a press statement couldn't touch. By 4 p.m., 2 of the 5 journalists had published follow-up pieces, specifically addressing the fabrication claim with Eleanor's certification numbers and the Korean Regulatory Archive access logs. Vincent's lawyer did not issue a third statement. At 5:15, a government financial investigative body announced it had opened a formal inquiry. Dominic was on calls continuously from that point. Ji-yeon moved through the penthouse with the particular controlled pace of someone managing a situation that was larger than any single conversation, feeding Dominic documents and contact information and managing incoming communications with a precision that Claire, even in the middle of everything, noticed and respected. She stayed out of those hours, not because she was excluded. Dominic had made clear she could be in any room she chose, but because this part wasn't hers. The organizational consequence of what they'd released was something Dominic had to navigate on his own terms, with his own people, in a language she didn't fully speak yet, even after a year in Seoul. She had done her part. The evidence was out. The authentication was certified. Her father's name was in the public record, attached to a regulatory filing, rather than a theft accusation. She went to the study. She sat at the desk. She opened her laptop and looked at the bibliography section of the paper she'd been working on, when everything had accelerated, still open, still waiting. The academic work of her actual life, sitting patient and mundane beside everything else. She worked on the bibliography for 2 hours. It was not avoidance. It was the opposite of avoidance. It was the most grounding thing she could think of, the ongoing ordinary work of the future she had come here to build, the one she wasn't giving up, regardless of what burned around it. Vincent called Dominic at 7 in the evening. Dominic took the call in the main living room and did not ask Claire to leave. She stayed on the couch with her laptop and made herself unobtrusive, and understood that this was a thing he was offering her, the choice to witness or not, and she chose to witness. She couldn't hear Vincent's side. She could hear Dominic. Yes, Dominic said. Then a long silence. No, another silence longer. That is not something I'm prepared to discuss as a negotiation. Silence. Vincent. His voice changed on the name dropped, became something very quiet that had nothing pleasant in it. You told my father that Thomas Whitmore stole from this family. You told him that at a graveside. You told it to a man who was buried in that ground 3 days later and could never learn otherwise. The silence that followed was the longest. There is nothing you can offer me that changes what you did with that knowledge. Whatever comes next, comes next. We're done talking. He ended the call. He stood in the living room for a moment with his back to her, one hand at his side, the other holding the phone that he set down on the table carefully. Carefully in the way you set something down when you don't trust your grip. Then he turned around. She looked at him. He looked at her. How bad is it? She said. Meaning the organizational fallout. Meaning the empire. Bad, he said. Not minimizing it. Not dramatizing it. The formal inquiry is going to take 18 months minimum. Several of our holding structures are going to be fully exposed. The legitimate operations, the ones that are genuinely clean, those can be separated and preserved. He sat down in the pushchair across from her. His jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled up in the way they got after hours. He looked like a man who had been working at full intensity for 10 hours and was somewhere between the third and fourth wind. The rest is going to be very expensive to deal with, financially and in every other way. But you can deal with it, she said. I can deal with it. The legitimate side, the trade companies, investment structures, the ones that are actually what they say they are. About 40% of the total portfolios, he said. Maybe 45. More than I thought, honestly, when I started actually auditing. My father built more real infrastructure than Vincent gave him credit for. She absorbed that. 40% of something is better than 100% of something that was always going to collapse when someone looked at it. Directly, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. They sat in the quiet of the penthouse. Outside, Seoul was doing its nighttime thing, the lights, the scale, the relentless forward motion of a city that didn't pause. The council, she said, divided. Park Sung-jin is with me. 3 others. The remaining members are waiting to see which direction the inquiry goes before they commit to anything. which is cowardice, but it's useful cowardice. He paused. Vincent's faction is 5 people. As of this afternoon, 2 of them have privately indicated they're willing to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure. By the time this is done, Vincent is going to be alone in a way that's very permanent. And Vincent himself? Dominic was quiet for a moment. My uncle spent 25 years being untouchable because he was the man nobody could afford to remove. He's no longer that man. He looked down at the table. He'll spend the next several years being very thoroughly touchable by a lot of people who've been waiting for exactly this moment. She nodded. Does that feel like enough? She said, not testing him, genuinely asking. He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she'd learned about him. He actually thought about questions before he answered them, even when thinking took longer than was comfortable. No, he said finally, because my father died not knowing. Because Thomas Whitmore lived 2 decades, carrying something he couldn't correct. Enough would require both of those men to be standing in this room, and they're not. He looked at her. But it's what there is. And what there is, I'm going to make it mean something. Hyjin came the following morning. Not summoned. Nobody summoned Hyjin Serrano. She arrived at 10 a.m. with the composed certainty of a woman who had decided her presence was required, and that was a complete sentence. She sat in the main living room. Dominic brought her tea and sat across from her. Claire came out of the study when she heard the voice, and Hyjin looked at her with those sharp, patient eyes and said, "Sit down, child." Claire sat. I have been watching this family make terrible decisions for 60 years. Hyjin said, not preamble, not softening. My husband made them. My son made them. Vincent has made them continuously and with great creativity. She held her teacup with both hands. The difference is that most of those decisions were made to hold something together that should have been taken apart a long time ago. Neither of them said anything. I know about the documents, she said. I've known about Thomas Whitmore since 2001. She looked at Dominic. Before you ask, I was told a version of Vincent's story. I had questions about it. I chose not to push. She paused, and something moved through her face that was not guilt, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a person who has carried a thing for a long time and is setting it down carefully. That was a failure. I know it was. I'm not asking you to excuse it. Dominic looked at his grandmother. Why didn't you push? He said. Because I was afraid of what I would find, she said plainly. And because I had already spent 30 years managing the consequences of the family I'd helped build, and I didn't have the capacity for what finding the truth would have required. She looked at her tea, told myself it was protection, that not knowing was a kind of protection for everyone, including the family. It wasn't. It was exhaustion masquerading as wisdom. She looked at Claire. Your father was a good man, she said. He did the right thing in a situation designed to make doing the right thing very costly. I'm sorry that this family was part of what made it cost what it did. Claire looked at the old woman across the table. She had not expected this. She had not expected the directness of it, the absence of defensive framing. She had prepared herself, in the days since she'd found the documents, for a version of this conversation that involved people explaining their positions and protecting their legacies and managing their accountability down to the smallest possible admission. Hyjin Serrano was 78 years old and apparently done managing. Thank you, Claire said. And then, because it was also true, he would have appreciated hearing it from someone who was there. Hyjin nodded once. I know he would have. A quiet settled in the room. Not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that arrives when something that needed to be said has been said and the air has accepted it. Then Hyjin looked between the two of them with the expression of a woman who has decided this particular topic is complete and the next one is beginning. What are you going to build? She said. Dominic looked at Claire. Claire looked back. We're working on that, Claire said. Work faster, Hyjin said. You have done the destruction part. Construction part is harder and more interesting, and you're wasting time being careful about it. The formal investigation took 14 months. It was not a clean process. It was not a narrative of smooth justice moving efficiently toward the right conclusion. It was 14 months of legal filings and depositions and document requests and contested authentications and 3 different attempts by Vincent's legal team to challenge the chain of custody of the evidence, each of which failed and each of which cost time and money and took something from the people who had to sit through them. Claire finished her graduate degree in March. She sat for her final examinations in January, while the investigation was active and her name was attached to news coverage in 3 countries, and her scholarship committee held an emergency meeting about whether her involvement in a financial fraud case made her a liability to the university. She appeared before that committee herself without Dominic, without legal representation, without anyone except herself, and 20 minutes of clear, documented explanation of her role in uncovering evidence of wrongdoing and the independent authentication of that evidence by a certified professional with 30 years of institutional standing. The committee voted to continue her scholarship. She went back to studying. In February, Vincent Serrano accepted a cooperation agreement with the investigating body. He did not admit to everything in the public document. He admitted to enough. His counsel position was formally terminated. His financial network, the one Eleanor, had spent 30 years helping build, and the last 14 months helping dismantle, was fully exposed and largely dissolved. He was not imprisoned. This was not a story where the villain was marched away in handcuffs on a bright day, while the principals watched from a courthouse step. Vincent Serrano was stripped of his power and his money and his position, and left in the particular cold that comes from having spent decades being indispensable to people who now found him too expensive to know. He was 67 years old, and he was not untouchable anymore, and that, in the world he'd inhabited, was its own kind of sentence. The government issued a formal statement in March, acknowledging the regulatory filing made by Miss Whitmore in the year 2000, confirming that the filing had been improperly suppressed, and formally entering the original documentation into the public record as evidence of a whistleblowing action conducted in good faith. Thomas Whitmore, international trade consultant, Portland, Oregon, age 51 at time of death, February 14th, 11 years prior. In good faith. Claire read that phrase in the official document 3 times. She was sitting at the desk in the study when she read it. The same desk where she'd opened her laptop on the first evening in the penthouse and worked on a bibliography. Because work was the most reliable thing she knew. She put the document down on the desk. She sat for a while. She thought about her father making scrambled eggs on Sunday mornings. She thought about the letter the decision I could live with, and what it had cost him to live with it quietly for 2 decades, and whether knowing that the document was now in the public record, that his name was attached to the right side of the history, would have been enough for him. She thought it probably would have been. She was also aware that it was 25 years too late, and that being right eventually is a different thing from being protected while you're right, and that the gap between those 2 things was something she intended to spend a long time thinking about in the work she was building. She wiped her face once with the back of her hand. She took a breath. Then she went to find Dominic. He was in the office they'd started sharing 3 months into the new structure, not the penthouse office, a different one, 1 floor down, in a building that housed what had become the operating core of what they were building, smaller than what had existed before, cleaner, with less in it that required concealment. The legitimate holding companies had been restructured under a new parent entity. Dominic had brought in an external audit firm in month 3 of the investigation and had given them full access to everything, not because he was required to, but because he'd decided that the only way to know what he was actually standing on was to have someone independent tell him. 43% of the original portfolio had been genuinely clean. They were building from 43%. It was less than what he'd had. It was also, as Claire had said in the living room, the night the investigation opened, better than 100% of something that couldn't survive inspection. He had made his peace with that arithmetic in ways that had taken longer than he would admit and had required several conversations with Jiyeon and several more with Hai-jin and 1 long night on the penthouse balcony watching. Soul in the dark that he hadn't told anyone about. He was at his desk when she came in. He looked up. He saw her face. He put down whatever he was holding. "It's in the public record," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "In good faith," he said. He'd read the same document that morning. Yes. He stood up. He came around the desk, and he stood in front of her and looked at her with the expression she still didn't have a single clean word for the one that had no architecture around it, no management, just the actual thing. Not enough, he said. No, she agreed. But it's real. It's real. He put his hand briefly against her face, the side of her jaw, just his palm for a moment, and she let him. And they stood in that office, in the building. They were rebuilding from 43%, and she felt the specific weight of everything the last 14 months had been, and didn't try to make it smaller or lighter than it was. I want to start something, she said after a moment. He lowered his hand, listening. A compliance structure, built into the new entity from the foundation. Not the kind that exists to provide cover, the kind that actually functions, with teeth and independence and a reporting mechanism that goes outside the organization if it has to. She looked at him. I want it to be part of what we build from the beginning, not added later, not retrofitted. From the beginning. He looked at her steadily. Based on what your father couldn't do, he said. Based on what my father already did, she said. He found it and reported it. The system failed, not him. I want to build something where the system doesn't fail. That's going to cost a significant, I know what it costs. And the external board will have authority over. Yes, real authority, not ceremonial. He was quiet. Working through it, she could see the analysis running. Yes, he said. She nodded. I'll have a proposal drafted by Friday. I know you will. And then, with the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth, you've had it half drafted since October, haven't you? September, she said. The ghost became something more specific. Of course it was. She walked across the graduation stage on a Saturday morning in May when Seoul was finally warm, when the city had shaken off the last of winter and was doing the thing it did in spring, sprawling and green and enormous, and somehow both ancient and completely contemporary. At the same time, contradiction that had taken her a year and a half to stop trying to resolve and simply inhabit. The ceremony was long. She had been to enough academic events to know that graduation ceremonies existed in a particular dimension of time that operated independently of clock time. And she had made her peace with this, and sat in the row with her fellow graduates, and listened to the speeches and thought, when the thinking wandered where it wanted to go, about her father sitting in his apartment in 1999 in the city, finding something in the financial documentation that required him to make a decision. She thought about the decision being lonely. She thought about it being right anyway. When they called her name and she crossed the stage and took the degree from the dean's hands, she did not look for the audience immediately. She looked at the object in her hands, the physical thing, the paper in the folder, and let herself feel the full specific weight of what it had taken to get here. Then she looked up. Haijin was in the third row, upright and precisely dressed, watching with the expression of a woman who approved of things that were earned rather than given and considered. This one earned. Mara was 2 seats down from Haijin, which Claire had not arranged, and which meant either Dominic had arranged it or they had found each other. And either way it was right. Dominic was at the end of the row. He was not a man who had ever, as far as she could determine, attended a university graduation ceremony in a full personal capacity. He stood out in the audience in the way things stand out, when they are exactly themselves in a context that expected something else. Too still, too contained, dressed with a precision that registered even from a stage. He was looking at her. She looked back. He had once said to her in a kitchen at midnight, while they were reconstructing a dish from memory and getting it mostly right, that the penthouse had felt like a waiting room before she moved in. He'd said it sideways, not as a declaration, just as a fact he was putting down somewhere. She'd understood at the time and hadn't said so. She descended from the stage. The ceremony continued around them. The sun was the kind of May sun that felt like a statement after a long winter. Haijin found her first and embraced her briefly and said nothing, which was more than enough. Mara shook her hand with both of hers and said, "Your father would have driven to the ceremony in the past tense, with the directness that was just Mara," and Claire laughed, which surprised her and felt correct. Then Dominic. He came from the end of the row, through the crowd that was redistributing itself after the ceremony, unhurried, and when he reached her, the crowd accommodated him, the way crowds had always accommodated him, without his asking, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her, in the way he looked at her when the construction was entirely down. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you." She looked up at him. "You came." "Yes." "You stood in a university gymnasium for 2 hours." 2 hours and 20 minutes, he said. She smiled. Not wide, she wasn't a wide smile person. Dominic knew this but real, which was the only kind she had. He reached into his jacket pocket. She saw what was coming. Not because he'd told her, not because she'd been waiting for it, simply because she knew him, simply because she knew him, and she knew the particular quality of his stillness when something mattered at the level that didn't have a professional category. It was not a large ring. She had mentioned once, in passing, that she found large rings unwieldy and impractical for someone who worked with documents and keyboards constantly. She had said it about someone else's ring, in passing, not expecting it to be retained. He had retained it. He held it in his palm and looked at her. The first time I asked you to do something with me, he said, I needed a problem solved. You did. I told you the terms and you negotiated better ones. I did. This is different. He looked at the ring and then back at her. There are no terms. There's no problem being solved. There's no contract at the end of it. He paused. I spent 10 years believing that controlling the variables around me was the same thing as strength. You spent about 6 months systematically demonstrating that it wasn't. He looked at her steadily. You are the most difficult person I have ever tried to manage. I know. I stopped trying around month 4. I know that too. Will you marry me, he said. Not formally. Not with performance. Just the question, direct. The way he said things when he decided to say them, without the architecture around them. She looked at him. She thought about the subway platform where it started. The old woman breathing wrong, the crowd moving past, the choice to stop that she'd almost not made and then made anyway, because something below the sternum said stop. She thought about a man terrible at saying thank you, and a year of watching him become someone who didn't need to manage every room he walked into, and a year of building something from 43% that was genuinely what it claimed to be. She thought about her father making the decision he could live with, and what it meant to build a life around decisions you could live with, and whether that was enough to ask of a life. She thought it probably was. She thought it was maybe everything. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which also had the quality of something retained and acted on without announcement. She looked at it for a moment, not the ring, exactly, but what it meant to say yes to something without a contract, without terms negotiated in a graduate school hallway, without the safety net of an exit clause. It felt, she decided, like the difference between doing something because it solved a problem and doing something because it was true. Her father had known the difference. She was her father's daughter. Around them, the graduation crowd moved and redistributed, and the May sun continued its statement, and Hai-Jin was watching from 10 feet away with the expression of a woman who had waited long enough to see. Something built correctly and found the wait worthwhile. Mara was looking at her phone with deliberate tact. Ji-yeon, who had appeared from somewhere, was already moving toward whatever logistical requirement came next, because that was Ji-yeon, and the world required it. Dominic stood in front of her, and she stood in front of him, and Seoul sprawled enormous and indifferent and alive in every direction, the city that had taken her father and returned his name to her, the city where she had stopped for an old woman on a platform and watched a year unfold from that small choice like something that had been waiting to unfold all along. She tucked the diploma under her arm. She looked at him. I have a proposal to finish, she said. The compliance structure. Due Friday. He looked at her with the ghost at the corner of his mouth. Then I suppose, he said, we should get to work. She took his hand. They walked out into the May morning together, not toward anything easy, not toward anything finished, because the thing about building something real from the ground up is that it is never finished, only continued. There would be the 14 remaining months of investigation fallout to navigate. There would be a compliance board to establish, and an external chair to hire, and a reporting structure to build with teeth that actually functioned. There would be her career, which was not his career, and his rebuilt organization, which was not her organization, and the ongoing project of 2 people who had ongoing projects negotiated the terms of something and then discovered that the thing they'd negotiated was only the beginning of something they hadn't negotiated at all. There would be, sometime in the future, a kitchen at midnight and something that needed reconstructing, and someone willing to say lower heat, and someone willing to listen, and the result would be not quite right, but close enough. And close enough at midnight was sometimes everything. Thomas Whitmore's name was in the public record. The empire was not what it had been. The ring was not large. The work was not done. None of it was easy. None of it was clean, and not one part of it had arrived without cost, to someone who deserved better than the cost. But it was real. And Claire Whitmore had learned, from her father, and from a year in Seoul, and from 43%, and from a man who had spent 10 years controlling variables and finally stopped. She had learned that real was the only currency that didn't eventually devalue. She held on to that. She walked forward into the morning. The story ended there not with resolution, in the sense of all things returned to smooth, but resolution in the truer sense, the sense of a chord that has been building through difficult keys, finally arriving at the note it was always moving toward, uncertain and earned, and entirely itself.